right, well, good afternoon and evening, everyone. Again, my name is Andrea Martinson. I work at Shiawassee National Wildlife Refuge as an interpretation park ranger there. Lots of my programs are mostly for elementary kids, so it's going to be kind of fun to be able to do it for a more mature audience here tonight. And so I've been here just shy of, or just a little bit over a year here in Michigan, and so it is fantastic to be back here after almost 10 years. Again, I started my career in 2015 up at Saginaw National Wildlife Refuge in the UP, which is a gorgeous refuge, so it is fun to be able to be back here in Michigan after all these years. And during my year here at Shiawassee National Wildlife Refuge, it has been absolutely fascinating to see Shiawassee National Wildlife Refuge and how it has such an important role here in the Saginaw Bay Watershed. So I'm really excited to be here with you all tonight and to share that story with all of you and how we have such a valuable role here in the Saginaw Bay Watershed in our community. But before we go into that, I just wanted to kind of take a step back and do a broad scope overview about even what is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, because as I mentioned in that intro, I've kind of bounced around all over the country through my career. I've been with the National Park Service, I've been with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and there's all sorts of fantastic land conservation agencies, but it can sometimes be easy to get those all confused and blurred together. So for example, we've got up here on the screen, we got the National Park Service, we got the U.S. Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, Department of Natural Resources, the Bureau of Land Management, and more. These are just scratching the surface. There are so many of them, so how in the world do you even distinguish between all of those? In my career, I oftentimes have explained how I'm a park ranger, and people have said, oh, so you work for the Michigan Department of Natural Resources, oh, or you work for the National Park Service, and so I'm not working for either of those. I'm working for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So it's easy to kind of get those all confused with each other. So just to kind of give a broad overarching view, I've got this org chart here. And this is for the Department of the Interior. So this is a federal branch or department within the federal government. And the Department of the Interior has all sorts of different bureaus underneath it. And one of those is going to be the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Alongside of it, we do also have the National Park Service, so that's kind of a sister agency, so to speak, with the Fish and Wildlife Service, as well as lots of other ones that are fantastic, like the Bureau of Land Management, the U.S. Geological Survey, and more. But what makes the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service distinct from all of those other great departments or bureaus within the Department of the Interior? Our mission is to work with others to conserve, protect, and enhance fish, wildlife, plants, and their habitats for the continuing benefit of the American people. That is going to be our mission with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And the word I want to hone in on there is going to be the word conserve. Conservation is the heartbeat of everything that we do within the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And so some examples of what we do that are going to include protecting endangered species, conserving and restoring habitat, wildlife and sport fish restoration, enforcing federal wildlife laws, restoring nationally significant fisheries, international conservation. So that's one thing that kind of makes us unique, is we actually work around the world with other nations to do conservation work, and managing migratory birds, which we'll definitely unpack that one later on this evening. But all of these are going to be examples of how the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is living out its mission of conservation. And so with that in mind, not only is Shiawassee National Wildlife Refuge a part of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, we are also going to be a program underneath the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and that is going to be the National Wildlife Refuge System. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is kind of like an octopus, where it's got all these different arms and all these different departments going in different directions, but they all are focusing on that conservation work. Now, in regards to the National Wildlife Refuge System, it has kind of a unique history to it. Does anyone recognize the species of bird in this next slide? And great egrets kind of have a long, thin, stork-like body. And they are very closely tied to conservation movements, because In the late 1800s, early 1900s, believe it or not, the great egrets were hunted for their feathers. They grow out these beautiful plumes in the breeding season, but I don't know who started the hat fashion of putting feathers in hats, but it was a thing. And in the early 1900s, it was to the point where the great egrets almost got to the point of extinction because of this hat fashion trend. But thankfully, this man was able to establish Pelican Island National Wildlife Refuge, which was the very first National Wildlife Refuge in 1903. And so that is going to be how the National Wildlife Refuge system was born, was through that conservation movement to protect not only the great egrets, but all of those migratory birds. And so that is going to be how the National Wildlife Refuge system got started. But what's really cool is that we've been able to live out this mission ever since. And it's a little bit of a mouthful, but I'll go ahead and read our mission as the National Wildlife Refuge System. It's to administer a national network of lands and waters for the conservation, management, and, where appropriate, restoration of the fish, wildlife, and plant resources and their habitats within the United States for the benefit of present and future generations of Americans. That's a mouthful, but the key word I want to focus in on that is, again, that conservation. Again, that's still the heartbeat of what we do out at Shiawassee National Wildlife Refuge is conservation work and restoration. And we have actually, since 1903, have been able to expand to over 580 different national wildlife refuges around the nation. So pretty much every single state is going to have a national wildlife refuge right there in their backyard. And here in Michigan, we have several. So we've got a couple in the Upper Peninsula. We've got Seney, that's where I started my career in 2015. We got a couple others in the UP. And then here we are at Shiawassee National Wildlife Refuge, kind of right here in the crook of the thumb. And so now that we've been able to kind of take that broad overarching view of learning more about the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and learning about the program of the National Wildlife Refuge system inside of it, now let's take a look at Shiawassee itself and how we play a role here in the Saginaw Bay Watershed. So first of all, we were established in 1953, so 50 years after that first National Wildlife Refuge was established, we were established here. We've got 10,000 acres that we manage. Again, I do lots of programs for kids, and so one image I like to describe for them to kind of figure that 10,000 acres is 1 acre is about the size of a football field. So if you imagine 10,000 football fields and smash them all together, that's how big our refuge is. And we've got lots of different types of habitat within those 10,000 acres. We've got wetlands, we've got prairie, we've got bottomland hardwood forest, all sorts of fantastic places for our wildlife to thrive. And we were primarily established to be a sanctuary for migratory birds. And the reason for that is because we are right along the path of something called the Mississippi Flyway. Now, the Mississippi Flyway is going to just be one of 4 major flyways that most migratory birds are going to use during their migration route. So we've got the Pacific Flyway in red, we've got the Central Flyway in green, we've got the Mississippi Flyway in blue, and then we have the Atlantic Flyway in black. And so again, we are part of the Mississippi Flyway, the blue one. And if you look really closely on this map, you'll notice that there are some birds that use the Mississippi Flyway that are coming all the way from Alaska, passing through Michigan, and then traveling all the way down into Central and South America. So those are thousands of miles that these birds are flying. So they're going to need to stop and rest along the way. But they can't just stop anywhere. They need to find a place that has the correct food, water, shelter, and space that they are looking for. So we at Shiawassee National Wildlife Refuge are trying to be the best rest area, so to speak, for these birds. So just like we humans have highways, that we have rest areas where we can pull off, stretch, take a break, and then continue on our journey. Shiawassee is trying to be the best pit stop possible for these migratory birds. And so one interesting thing is that we have over 381 different bird species that utilize the refuge. And there are 31 species of migratory non-game birds that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has a species of concern list here in the Great Lakes. And of those 31 species, 20 of them are found in Shiawassee. So that's showing how much of an important role the refuge is having on these critically, the management of concern for these species. And our peak populations for our migrations are pretty much April for the spring migration and late October for the fall migration. So we are just kind of finishing up our peak migration, but there is still migration happening all the way through the winter for different species, which is pretty fascinating. Now, we do have other notable wildlife besides migratory birds passing through the refuge. Anyone know what type of species this snake is? Any ideas? Oh, that's a good guess. It's not the rattlesnake. It's actually going to be the eastern fox snake. But eastern fox snakes are going to actually be threatened species. They are only found in Michigan, Ohio, and Ontario. And they are active typically from mid-April to late October. They are non-venomous, so that is very helpful to know. But unfortunately, they actually can be really good at behaving like rattlesnakes. They'll, when they feel threatened, they'll actually coil up and they'll shake their tail and hiss simultaneously and pretend to be a rattlesnake to scare off any predators. But they actually do a little bit too good of a job at it because unfortunately their populations are declining due to multiple different factors. But one of those is unfortunately people that are killing them thinking that they are rattlesnakes. And so there's population declines from that, as well as habitat loss, poaching, and roadkill. So those are going to be some of the reasons that we have a threatened status for the eastern fox snake. But the good news is that we do have a nice healthy population of them inside the refuge.
How big would that snake be?
How big would the snake be? It would be typically about 3 to 4 feet, full grown. Yep. Any guesses as to what type of turtle this is? No, not quite. No. Oh, that's close. It's a Blandling's turtle. So the Blandling's turtle, it's noted, it's got the bright yellow neck is probably going to be the best identifying marker for it. But this is a near threatened species in the nation, and it's a species of concern here in Michigan. And so they travel long distances in order to find places for feeding, nesting, and breeding. And so they don't stay in one spot like some other turtle species do. They're traveling long distances over different types of habitat. And so they're endangered from the habitat loss or fragmentation, and also roadkills, poaching, and low reproduction rates. That's definitely a really big hit for this one, because if they lose even just 1 or 2 adults, since they take over 20 years to become sexually mature, that's a pretty big hit for them, is if they aren't able to reproduce. But the good news is that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has actually partnered with the Saginaw Children's Zoo and Detroit Zoo to raise these turtles in captivity. And because even though they do sometimes have adult mortality, they're a lot more susceptible to mortality when they are young. And so if they're raised in captivity until they're full-grown adult and then released into the wild, they have a much better chance of survival. So that's going to be one program that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has been working on, and we're in the monitoring phase of that project now. All right, any ideas on what type of frog this is? Leopard frog, excellent. So we got the northern leopard frog. It lives up to its name with the spots. So they require slow-moving or still water for their breeding and tadpole habitat. Unfortunately, their population has declined throughout the United States and including in the Great Lakes region. And they're in danger from habitat loss, pesticides, because they do actually breathe and have high absorption through their skin. So those pesticides can be pretty detrimental to them, and non-native species predation. They are uncommon in the area, but some local populations can be pretty abundant, including at the refuge. We have a very good, healthy population of leopard frogs that are very abundant in the springtime and summer, which is fantastic. Now, this one's pretty famous. Any ideas on what type of butterflies this is? Monarch, excellent. And so they are very famous for their migration. They're the insect with the longest migration in the whole country. And they travel from Canada to either Mexico if they're the eastern population, or Southern California if they're the western population. But their life cycle is completely dependent on the milkweed, because that is the only plant that the adults will ever lay their eggs in. and it's the only plant that the larva or the caterpillar are going to eat off of. And what's interesting is that the milkweed is actually going to provide a toxin for them, so that if anything was to try to eat that monarch, it would taste bitter, and so that's going to be a symbiotic relationship happening there. It's very important to know that relationship between the monarch and the milkweed, because unfortunately the populations of monarchs are declining as well nationally, and so we're trying to get more of that milkweed, get more of the monarchs, because they are in danger of, they're actually working on potentially getting them listed as an endangered species right now, so that's definitely something that we have on our radar. Then we've got lots of different owl species. Anyone know what this one specifically is? This is a little bit of a smaller owl. It's called the short-eared owl because of those teeny tiny little ear tufts that they sometimes will stick up. But their habitat is large open spaces with low vegetation typically. And they are loosely colonial breeders, which means that they won't be comfortable enough to nest unless there is a larger group of them all together. And they are a fish and wildlife species of concern due to sharp population declines, and they are threatened in the Great Lakes region specifically due to diminishing marshes and grasslands. But thankfully we do again have a good population of these inside the refuge because we have the right habitat for them. And then we've got this beautiful songbird. Anyone know what this one is? So this is going to be a prothonotary warbler. And they are going to be interesting because they have a very specific nest requirement. They only nest in tree cavities with trees that are in standing water. And on top of that, they avoid forest patches that are smaller than 250 acres. So those are very, very specific habitat requirements for this bird. And because of that, unfortunately, they do also have population declines due to that habitat loss. What's interesting is that this Shiawassee National Wildlife Refuge is the only place in Michigan that this bird is going to be nesting in because it has that specific habitat requirements that it is looking for. It does have a southern habitat range throughout the southern United States, but this is its very most northern range is going to be at Shiawassee. So those are going to be different species of note besides migratory birds inside Shiawassee National Wildlife Refuge. And all of them are going to be thriving specifically at the refuge because we have the exact type of habitat that they are looking for. So we truly are a refuge in that sense for these species. So not only are those migratory birds and those special species an identity of, or part of our identity at Shiawassee, water is going to be another key part of who we are at the refuge as well. And that's going to be for multiple different reasons. So first of all, we're part of the Great Lakes Basin ecosystem, and that is going to actually contain 18% of the world's freshwater supply. So almost 1/5 of the entire world's freshwater supply is right here in our backyard. We are also part of the Saginaw Bay Watershed, as you all are aware. And so the Saginaw Bay Watershed is the largest watershed in the whole state of Michigan. So you can see this map right here. This is depicting the Saginaw Bay Watershed. It has 22 counties that it is a part of. And what's interesting is that the Saginaw River and 4 of its main tributaries actually pass directly through the refuge and converge on site at the refuge to form Saginaw River itself. So we've got the Flint River, the Shiawassee River, the Cass River, and the Tidwawassee River all merging in the refuge to form Saginaw River, which flows into Saginaw Bay of Lake Huron. And those different rivers drain 75% of the largest watershed in the whole state of Michigan. So water is a really key part of our identity, and we take that very seriously in regards to our water management. And so water management at the refuge is tied to flood control because we are part of the Shiawassee Flats, and that is the Shiawassee floodplain. So we do have lots of floodwaters coming through our refuge as well. In fact, the refuge is directly connected to Lake Huron, so much so that even though we're 20 miles inland from the lake, we are considered a coastal wetland. And so coastal wetlands have direct connection so that if the waters rise in the lakes, then the water is going to rise in the refuge as well, even though it's 20 miles inland. In fact, there's some times when the lake rises so much that waters in the refuge, the Saginaw River, is actually going to flow backwards into the refuge. So that's going to be certainly something that we have to take in consideration when we're doing our water management strategies in the refuge. And wetlands are also going to be a very important part of who we are. The wetlands in the refuge is going to be probably our most predominant landscape besides our bottomland hardwood forest. And wetlands are crucial not only for the wildlife but also for humans as well, for multiple different reasons. First of all, they help stabilize the soils and stream banks of rivers. So that's going to be really important with keeping those banks from eroding away. They also are going to help work as like a water purifier so that the water leaving the refuge is actually cleaner than the water coming into it. And they do that by helping kind of filter out all of the sediment, nutrients, and pesticides from that surface water. And they're going to work like a sponge in regards to soaking up floodwaters. One very poignant example of that was back in 2020 when the Sanford dams burst up near Midland. And so all of that water was rushing down the Shiawassee River towards Saginaw and Bay City, and the refuge was directly in its path. But the refuge was able to absorb a large amount of that flood water so that it was able to help kind of absorb and cushion the flood from Saginaw and Bay City. So I've got some pictures here of that flood. This is an aerial overview of the refuge during that flood. Now again, we've got 10,000 acres that we manage. The entire refuge was under 10 feet of water during this flood event. So we've got this one here. This is a kind of the heart of the refuge right here with our bottomland hardwood forest. You can see how all that water is seeped into those wetlands. These are the open pools of the refuge right here. They're all underwater. For those of you who have been to the refuge, this little white line is our wildlife drive, which I'll certainly talk about later. This is the Shiawassee River itself. And so normally the wildlife drive is a good 10 to 15 feet above the Shiawassee River. This, it's showing it's barely above water right now. And then you can see right here, there's a teeny tiny little house and the waters are just stopping shy of it. And then this is another picture. This is Saginaw right here. This is the Shiawassee River, the Cass River, and the Shiawassee River all merging right here and forming Saginaw River. So you can see all that flood water is here in the refuge. And then Saginaw itself, it still has some, but it definitely is not nearly as much as it would have been if not for the refuge. So the refuge and the wetlands that we have not only are going to be helping the wildlife, but they're also going to be helping human society in many, many different ways. So I mentioned that they're important for wildlife, and here's a couple reasons why. 40% of mammals and 75% of reptiles and amphibians depend on wetlands for their life cycle, at least part of, if not all, of their life cycle. 71 fish species rely on wetlands for spawning in nurseries. But unfortunately, between the 1780s and the 1980s, over 11 million acres of wetlands were drained and lost. And so because of that, over 100 different bird species were impacted from whether they use them for nesting, feeding, or habitat during their migration. Over 111 different species of birds were impacted from those declining wetlands. So with all of that in mind, with the history and the importance of the watershed, with the importance of the wetlands and the heartbeat of conservation that we have with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Wildlife Refuge System, our mission is to preserve and manage an undeveloped expanse of floodplain forest, marshes, rivers, and associated habitat through 4 main strategies. And those strategies are going to be habitat management, encouraging public stewardship, educational programs, and private land activities. So habitat, for just a quick little definition, the primary goal of it is to provide fish and wildlife with diverse habitats that are going to fulfill their requirements for feeding, resting, and nesting. And we have lots of different strategies on how we are doing our management in our habitats. And so our primary one is going to be water manipulation. I mentioned earlier about how water is a key part of who we are at Shiawassee National Wildlife Refuge. We've got the 4 rivers converging directly in the refuge to form Saginaw River, and that flows up into Saginaw Bay. And so those 4 rivers are going to be a core part of their conservation strategy. And so we have established throughout the refuge various water control structures, and those water control structures are able to tap into those 4 different rivers. So we're able to raise and lower the water levels throughout the refuge at will throughout the year. And so that raising and lowering of the water is going to help promote certain plants to grow that we are looking for to be the primary habitat for a migratory waterfowl. So one thing that's interesting about the history of the refuge is that we were established in 1953, and lots of our land was agricultural fields at the time, believe it or not. And those agricultural fields, they were there because they wanted to have carbohydrates for the migratory waterfowl passing through. But the thing is, as more research was occurring in the mid to late 1900s, they realized that the limiting factor for these migratory waterfowl isn't carbohydrates, it's actually proteins. And so proteins are going to be really important for these birds, especially during the spring migration when there's lots of egg production. And so protein was going to be the source that we were looking for in regards to what sort of plants we wanted in the refuge. So foxtail, for example, or millet are really rich in proteins in their seed heads. And so we are raising and lowering the water levels throughout the year to help promote those plants to grow in the refuge, and timing it just right and having just the right amount of shallow water so that when the migrations occur, it is the perfect landing spot for these migratory waterfowl. So water manipulation is going to be a key part of our strategy. This is a picture of one of our moist soil units. It's a very specific type of wetlands that is controlled by those raising and lowering of the waters. But there are other strategies that we are using for habitat management. We are also managing our invasive species. So we have a couple of different invasive species in the refuge. And an invasive species, just for a quick terminology, is that it has to be a plant that is non-native, but it also has to be a plant that is aggressively expanding in that area. And so invasive species can be Phragmites, that's a very famous one. And then there's also buckthorn is a really big one in the refuge that we're dealing with. Purple loosestrife, those are going to be the sorts of invasive species that we are dealing with. And so there's a couple different strategies that we use to combat them. First is mechanical removal, which is going to be literally pulling them out by hand or pulling them out by machinery. Then there's using herbicides, and so we have herbicides that target that very specific plant without harming the other plants around it, which is very handy. And then there's also biological removal. So purple loosestrife is a good example of this because there is a certain type of native beetle that loves to eat purple loosestrife, and so we are able to introduce more of that the beetle into the refuge, which is its native habitat anyways. And so that was going to be able to help combat against that purple loosestrife. So mechanical, chemical, and biological are going to be the 3 main strategies for invasive species removal in the refuge. Then we have prescribed fire. So believe it or not, prescribed fire is an excellent management tool for habitats. There's a couple different reasons for that. First of all, it is another way of removing invasive species because native grasses, they're used to fire as part of their cycle. And so invasive species actually aren't as able to come back from the prescribed burn as much as the native species are. So it kind of gives them a head start in regrowing in the native grasses. It also helps recycle nutrients back into the soil so that the plants that grow up after that prescribed burn are actually richer and healthier for animals than before. I've done prescribed fires both in North Dakota and here in Arizona, and it's fascinating to see the wildlife respond afterwards. Out in North Dakota specifically, the bison and the pronghorn and the mule deer were just feasting on the grass after the prescribed burn because it had those rich nutrients they were looking for. So it helps cycle the nutrients, it helps combat against invasive species, and there's going to be some sorts of plants, jack pine for example, that actually requires fire as part of its natural cycle because the seed cones actually are going to release their seeds at a certain temperature, and it actually is only acquired through heat. And so there's all sorts of great benefits to prescribed fire if done properly. So that is a tool that we use. What's interesting is that we actually did prescribe fire back in April, and it's really fascinating to see how quickly it responds, the landscape does. So this is a picture of the day of the burn. This was April 11th. So this is going to be a portion of the field that we burned. Take a look at this picture 4 months later. The very same spot 4 months later, and it's already grown back that quickly. So it's really cool to be able to see how, if we appropriately manage these landscapes, they can just thrive and help all these different wildlife species. So 4 months later, it looks as if it's never been burned. It's pretty cool. So prescribed fire is a great management tool. Hunting actually is a good management tool. Deer is a perfect example of this. So deer, their natural predators were going to be the wolf, the black bear, and the mountain lion. But those 3 species were extirpated out of this area, and so now these deer have no natural predators left in this area to manage them. And so because of that, if we don't manage them properly, then their population can skyrocket, and that leads to starvation as they overbrowse, and it also can lead to susceptibility of diseases. So hunting is actually a very helpful management tool for deer populations. There's lots of research that goes into exactly how many deer to cultivate each year. And so they're able to calculate exactly how many deer is a healthy population count for the refuge, and then we're able to hunt down to that level. So that's a very helpful management tool that we use. And then last but certainly not least is restoration. Again, conservation and restoration are the heartbeat of what we do in the refuge. And there's lots of different ways that we are doing restoration work in the refuge. But one thing to keep in mind is that restoration does not happen overnight, and it is a long-term process. We've been working on restoring the heart of the refuge, so to speak, for over 12 years now. And so it has been a long process, but it has been absolutely fascinating to see how it's been responding over those years. So this is a picture of showing kind of the area that has been in the process of being restored. There were 5 main phases of this restoration project. It started back in 2011. And so phase 1 was going to be this area right here, and then phase 2 was going to, this is kind of more of the open pools and wetlands. It was back when we were first established, that was going to be lots of the agricultural fields I mentioned earlier, was kind of right here in this area. Then we've got phase 2, which is going to be in the more forested region of the refuge. Then there's phase 3, which is going to be, it used to be agricultural fields, now it's going to be those moist soil units I mentioned earlier. Phase 4 is going to be in the northeast corner, kind of a mixture of forest and prairie. And then phase 5 we just finished actually just this past fall. And so that's going to be the open prairie area of the refuge now. Other things to point out on this map, these yellow dots are going to be those water control structures I mentioned earlier. And so those are what are going to be opening and lowering those gates and allowing water into the refuge. And then these little tiny blue lines, it's kind of hard to see, but that's going to be depicting the water flow through the refuge. Because originally all these were going to be waterways that were connected together before the wetlands were drained over 100 years ago. And so we are slowly knitting them back together and restoring the wetlands to the way they were over 100 years ago. And so this is a picture of the water control structures. This one we just installed this past fall. And so that's going to be, it's kind of, you can't tell based on this picture, but that's going to be connecting 2 different prairie units together underneath this road. So you see lots of these kind of around the refuge. That's going to be those water control structures. So this is a really cool picture because this is back in 2017. And so you can see that part of this area has been restored already since this restoration started back in 2011. But you can still see it's got a fair amount of fields still in it. This is the Shiawassee River, again, just to kind of give a little landmark there. Take a look at this picture in 2023 though. So same exact area, just a couple of years later, take a look at all of that new wetland space and how much water absorption it's able to do, and how much more wetland habitat is available for all those migratory birds between 2017 to 2023. So that's going to be the sort of restoration work that we are just now in the final stages of completing after starting all the way back in 2011. So because of that long-term restoration project, that's given us fantastic opportunities to research and monitor the different species in the refuge and see how they've been responding to this restoration work that we've been doing. So one obviously is going to be the migratory birds, seeing how have they been responding as we've been working on this restoration project, and the results have been absolutely fascinating. Believe it or not, we actually have a contractor who comes out every week and counts literally as many birds as he can see in a single day. It is absolutely mind-boggling. I went out with him the first month or two I was in the refuge. I just had started, just was still getting to learn the place, and I shadowed him on his trip around the refuge. And it was very similar to pictures like this. And he would just be firing away all the different species that he would see and counting up all of the different individuals. It was mind-boggling. But so he was going to be able to calculate how many different birds there were out there and how many different species were out there as well. It's literally from dawn to dusk, though. It is an all-day endeavor. But he does that every single week, and they've been calculating that data for the past 10 years. So because of that careful data he's been collecting, we're able to see how the trends in the birds have been responding to this restoration work. And it has been phenomenal to be able to see not only the numbers of the individuals of each population or each species boost, but also the diversity of those species have increased dramatically over the past 10 years, which is very, very exciting. We also have been doing fish monitoring. So this is a project in collaboration with the U.S. Geological Survey. And we actually installed a sonar camera underwater that was able to do videos of fish passing through into the refuge from the rivers. And so this is going to be that sonar camera. So these little green boxes are going to be representing fish that are being detected as they're passing in and out of the refuge. And so we monitored them coming in and out of the refuge. Now we're still in the process of collecting all that data. It's pretty astronomical how much the imagery they were able to get. So they've processed nearly 10,000 hours so far. And of that, they've detected 18 million fish that were detected passing in and out of the refuge at that time. So that's going to be really helpful for us because as we're opening and closing those water control structures throughout the year, we want to know when the fish are most likely to come into the refuge, whether it be for spawning purposes or for feeding purposes. We want to know that so that we want to open and time the opening and closing of those gates at the proper times for these fish to thrive. So that's going to be another type of monitoring that we're working on right now. We also are doing cattail research in the refuge right now. This is in collaboration with Loyola University of Chicago. Now, we've got multiple different types of cattail species in the refuge. Some of them are native, which is good. However, some of them are invasive, and unfortunately, they can sometimes hybridize, which makes it extremely difficult. And one of those invasive species is a hybrid cattail. And so what Loyola University is doing is they are harvesting that cattail and they're actually converting it into something called biochar. So biochar is going to be a stable form of carbon that binds very easily to nutrients and excess pollutants. And so what they're doing is they're harvesting that invasive cattail, converting it into biochar, and then actually putting it back out into the refuge. The reason they are doing that is because that biochar is then absorbing the extra nutrients and pollutants that we don't want in the refuge. So it's very much a win-win strategy where we're removing an invasive and making sure it doesn't propagate. We're converting it into something that's going to be useful to us and then putting it back into the refuge to reduce the pollutants in the wetlands. So it's a really interesting study that we're still in the process with. This machine is what they use to harvest the cattail itself. And when they're done, it kind of looks like this big mound of kind of cut up different cattails. And then they have this little area where they convert it into biochar. And so once that's done in the converting into biochar stage, then they're going to start spreading it back out into the refuge and are able to calculate how much pollutants are being absorbed through that biochar, which is pretty interesting. So that's going to be all the research that is happening more in the heart of the refuge, but there are other parts of the refuge that we are restoring beyond that as well. So this is going to be kind of the northern section of the refuge. The heart of the refuge that we've been talking about so far is south of the Tittabawassee River. This is a section of the refuge that is north of the Tittabawassee River. So it's called the Greenpoint area. It's also called Germania because there used to be a golf course up there called Germania Golf Course. We actually acquired that land back in 2014, and so what we've been doing ever since is we have been restoring it back into bottomland hardwood forest and open prairie. So we are still in the stages of this restoration work as well. This chart's kind of showing the different stages of that restoration work because, again, restoration does not happen overnight. It is a long-term process. So the stage that we just wrapped up literally like 2 weeks ago is going to be restoring of a pond off of the Tittabawassee River. And now we're going to be in the stages of that forest restoration and that prairie restoration. So we're really excited about this project as well. And we're going to be able to see how those new habitats are going to be helping the wildlife. And it's also cool because it is directly next to Saginaw City itself. So this is going to be a fantastic community asset for people to come out and hike and experience the refuge for themselves. So those are all the ways that we are doing our habitat management, but that again is just one of our 4 different ways that we are living out our mission at Shiawassee National Wildlife Refuge. The second of them is going to be public stewardship and engaging visitor community outreach. So there's going to be lots of different ways that people are able to experience the refuge for themselves. The most popular way is going to be wildlife observation and photography. There's lots of fantastic ways for people to come out and experience the refuge for themselves, and we'll talk about some in a little bit. Hunting is another great way for people to come out and experience the refuge. We mentioned the deer hunting earlier, but we do also have waterfowl hunting and small game hunting. Then we have fishing in the refuge. So you can fish on any navigable waterways, and so that includes the 4 rivers I talked about earlier and another part called the Spalding Drain. So we do have fishing in the refuge. I get asked this a lot. So some major species that we have include white bass, walleye, channel catfish, and carp. Hiking and biking, that's another great opportunity to explore the refuge for yourself. We actually have over 13 miles of trails that are available for you to explore. Now, kind of our key areas that are most famous for people to experience the refuge are going to be our wildlife drive and one of our hiking trails called the Ferguson Bayou Trail. So this is a map that's the heart of the refuge right here. And so this yellow line is going to be our 6.5 mile wildlife drive. It is a one-way gravel drive, and it is a fantastic way to experience all the different habitats of the refuge. So the moist soil units I was talking about earlier, the open pools and wetlands that were restored, and our bottomland hardwood forest. They do include 2 observation decks, so one right here at the corner of the Shiawassee River, and then one right here at this corner overlooking these 2 pools. So, and then there are also multiple pull-offs along the way. Since it is a one-way drive, we do have pull-offs so that people who want to take a little bit slower time and really take a slower experience of the refuge can pull off to the side so that other people can pass by. So we do have those as well. Now, one key thing to remember about the wildlife drive is that it is only open from June 1st to September 30th. And that is because during the key migration season, we want to be able to make this a place that the birds can truly rest along their migration routes. So that's going to be a key reason why it's open during the summer season only. But the good news is that we do have other ways to experience the refuge, even in the fall, winter, and spring. And the Ferguson Bayou Trail is our most popular way to do that, because that is this hiking trail right here. So you can still access all this fantastic habitat in this hiking trail. So this is going to be a 5-mile loop right here. You certainly don't have to do the whole thing, though. You can do a portion out and back and still experience a fantastic part of the refuge. It is pretty flat, but it is a part grass, part gravel trail. And it does include a photo blind right here out overlooking this moist soil unit. And then it does include 2 observation decks along the way, one right here and then one right here at the beginning. And this is a really fun one because we just finished restoring this area. So there are literally thousands of sandhill cranes right there in that area at the observation deck, which is pretty fantastic. Now this is open year-round from dawn to dusk, except during deer hunts, because we do not want anyone hiking out there during deer hunts. So that is the only time it is closed. But we do have other hiking trails as well. The Ferguson Bayou Trail is our most common one. So then we have the Woodland Trail. And so the Woodland Trail is going to be in more the northern sections of the refuge. But it is a 4.5-mile loop. This big one right here, I should say, is the 4.5-mile loop. This is more like a 2-mile loop right here. But it is going to be a primitive trail, so it's going to be dirt primarily. But it explores all this fantastic bottomland hardwood forest. So it's a really cool part of the refuge. And it also has a little bit more history to it in regards to there's some landmarks from the coal mine industry, which is pretty cool. So it is very popular for hiking and biking and for this fishing access right here along the Shiawassee River. So that's another great part of experiencing the refuge. And it is also open year-round from dawn to dusk, except during deer hunts. All right, so now last but not least, we have our Greenpoint trails. And so this is going to be pretty close to the Germania restoration that I was talking about earlier. The Germania restoration is kind of right here at this top left corner. So the hiking trails here, these are nice and short little trails. I use them a lot of times for field trips because they're all less than a mile long, essentially. This blue one is the longest, that's a 1-mile loop, but all these other little intersections are going to be short little trails. So they're a great way to experience the refuge. The whole area is only 2.5 miles total. But it has also primitive trails. It explores those bottomland hardwood forest habitats, and it does have fishing access along the Shiawassee River as well. No biking or hunting is allowed in this area, which means that it is truly open year-round. I know that I mentioned that the Woodland Trail and Ferguson Bayou are open year-round, except during those hunts. This one truly is open year-round because it is a no hunting zone, which definitely comes in handy. So our third way that we are living out our mission at Shiawassee National Wildlife Refuge is educational programs, and that's kind of where my job comes into play a little bit more. So these are going to be our opportunities where we go to classrooms, we have field trips, bus tours, guided hikes, events on-site and off-site. Those are all going to be kind of my contribution, so to speak, to the staff in sorts of being the public engagement coordinator. And so I love doing these events. They're definitely the highlight of my job. And so it's fantastic to be able to kind of share what we are doing at the refuge with audiences of all ages. And for anyone who's interested, we do also have a Facebook page. So this is a great way to see what we are doing in the refuge and all sorts of great opportunities to get involved. And then last but certainly not least, private land activities. That's going to be our fourth way that we are living out our strategy at Shiawassee National Wildlife Refuge. And this one's going to be a little bit more unique from the others because we do have a private lands officer. She oversees 22 counties in central Michigan, and her job is to partner with voluntary landowners who want to restore and enhance habitat on their own property. And so she does an amazing job working with them and has been able to restore wetlands, native grasslands, planting pollinator gardens, and helping improve local communities. And this is happening off-site of the refuge, which I think is fantastic, is that we're able to do this restoration work both at the refuge and throughout our community. So this is a picture of a field that she worked with a local landowner who wanted to restore his land into a wetland. And this is the same area a couple years later. And so it's been really cool to be able to see how we've been able to restore not only in the refuge, but also outside of the refuge, these amazing wetland communities. But those are going to be our 4 main strategies to living out our mission at Shiawassee National Wildlife Refuge. It is an ongoing story. The story is far from over, but I'm really excited to be able to share the story that we've gotten through so far with you, and hopefully you'll be able to come out and experience the refuge for yourself and be a part of our story as well. But now is a great time. If you have any questions, feel free to fire away. Yes?
We were talking just the other day about evaporation on Saginaw Bay. I was wondering if there's any concern in the wildlife area for that.
So in regards to concerns about evaporation in the wetlands, we have not had any concerns about that thus far, but that certainly is on our radar. Good question.
That has a lot to do with the ice cover too.
It does, absolutely, absolutely.
Does National Geographic ever did an article on Shiawassee?
National Geographic doing an article on the refuge. Not since I've been here, but I've only been here a year, so it could very well have been in the past, and I'm just not aware of it.
At the Bridgeport exit on I-75, there's a sign that's part of the refuge. Is that like a satellite section? It certainly is not connected.
So there are a couple other units close to Bridgeport that are part of refuge property. So there's kind of the main hub of the refuge, and then we actually have little land parcels that have been donated over the years, and so it's kind of a little lattice work or patchwork where there's some that are all bunched together, and then there's a couple little outliers. So 2 of them are near Bridgeport. So if it says refuge boundary, it is a legit part of the refuge.
We're relative to the Shiawassee area where the Native American archaeological digs.
On site, actually. So we do have archaeological digs occurring on site. Great question.
Want to let people know too that you can take tours around, not right into it, but around the Shiawassee on a boat. The Johnny Panther?
That's right. Yes, thank you for reminding me. So there is a third party that likes to do tours through the refuge called Johnny Panther, and he does boat tours on refuge. It is not a refuge staff member who does that tour. It is a third party organization, but that is a great way to be able to experience the refuge as well. Great point.
And you ice skating in the winter.
Can you ice skate in the winter? So I would not recommend it. You can do cross-country skiing though on the trails, so that is a good winter activity in the refuge.
How has Phragmites impacted the refuge?
How has Phragmites impacted the refuge? Thankfully, we do not have a ton of it in the refuge, and so we've been able to maintain it and make sure that it doesn't rapidly spread, because we were able to. The thing about invasive species is that if you detect it early, it's so much easier to manage it than if you detect it late. So thankfully we were able to detect it early enough that we're able to keep it at a manageable level so that it isn't rapidly spreading and destroying the rest of the habitat. I think I saw a hand over here somewhere. Maybe I made it up.
I have a question.
Sure.
If we have questions for local problems that we see, who do we contact?
So if it is outside of the refuge property, then the Michigan Department of Natural Resources is going to be your best bet, because that's kind of going back to the beginning of the talk where I talked about how it's so easy to get all these different land agencies confused with each other. So if it is on refuge property, definitely call us, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. It is off management property, then I would contact the Michigan Department of Natural Resources.
Is there more than one kind of milkweed?
Yes, there are different types of milkweeds. There's swamp milkweed, there's common milkweed. Oh no, there's a third type and I'm blanking on the name, but there's at least 3 different types of milkweed species.
For one over the other that you know?
No. So there's different types of milkweed that is going to thrive in different types of habitats. So swamp milkweed is the type of milkweed that we have most predominantly at the refuge, but common milkweed is also a great species for butterflies as well. And the adult, one thing I forgot to mention about the monarchs is that the adult butterflies can have nectar from other flowers besides the milkweed, but they only lay their eggs on the milkweed plant, and the caterpillars will only eat the leaves in the milkweed plant. So that's kind of the really core part of their life cycle is on the milkweed, but the adults certainly use the nectar from the milkweed plants too.
I bought a milkweed from a greenhouse. That's okay?
Absolutely. Definitely buying milkweed from greenhouses is totally good.
How often do you see these snakes there?
How often do we see the fox snakes?
They swim around or they get in a drive? What do they do?
So I have yet to see one personally myself. So I've been out there a year and I have yet to spot one. So that might be one example. But again, they're a threatened species, so it is a pretty rare finding for them. Fantastic questions. Yes.
Do you have Mississauga drivers?
So that is even rarer than the fox snake. Technically, we are in their habitat range, but it is extremely, extremely rare to spot one of those guys.
Where do those snakes fit in the food chain?
So the snakes in the food chain, they're going to play a really key role in regards to keeping the population of the rodents down, because if they didn't have the fox snakes or other snake species for that matter, then those rodent populations would just explode. So they really are important in keeping them down. But snakes can be a really good food source for a lot of other species. We've got lots of hawks, eagles, and ospreys that like to feed on them. Coyotes occasionally, fox occasionally. But mostly the birds of prey are going to be the key species that are going to be eating the fox snakes. Yes.
How large is the staff out there, and are they on site?
Great question. We, believe it or not, have just 5 staff members right now. So we've got a lot on our plate right now. That we definitely have our work cut out for us in regards to what we are doing at the refuge with 5 staff members.
Any bald eagles?
Lots of bald eagles, lots and lots. I think the most we counted in one day was like over 30. So we've got tons of bald eagles out there. We actually have a couple nests that you can see directly from the wildlife drive, so that's pretty cool.
What's the deepest spot?
The deepest spot, like water-wise, I'm assuming, so that's going to be some of our pools. I'm blanking on the depth of them right now, but it's at least, I'm going to say like 10 to 12 feet deep as the deepest pools, but most of the time we like it as shallow water. It's pretty rare that we get it that deep, though. That flood season, that'd be very rare to get that deep. All right, well, thank you again so much for having me tonight. It has been fantastic. And I hope you all have a great rest of your evening.